One syringe. A wild Mustang Foal, barely clinging to life. And a single sentence was all it took for one woman to defy death itself. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a scientist. But in that defining moment, she became the last line between life and oblivion. What happened next, no one could explain. All they knew was that something came alive. And with it, a silent thread was pulled, awakening a memory long buried by time. But who was truly brought back to life? The horse, or the woman herself? Open your heart and follow this story to the very end. Because some miracles aren't meant to be believed. They're meant to be witnessed. The Wyoming plains scorched under the mid-spring sun, as if the sky itself had dropped a furnace onto the earth. Grains of sand flew with the wind like golden blades slicing against bare skin. In a small, fenced pen surrounded by desolation, a fragile creature lay curled like a forgotten note from creation itself. The wild Mustang Foal was just 3 days old, too young to be named, too weak to earn one. A name was only given to those expected to survive. But this one was little more than a shadow of life. Its once soft brown coat had faded to a ghostly gray, cracked and sunken from dehydration. Ribs jutted like jagged ridges, barely sheathed by skin. Its eyes were clouded over like frozen ponds, void of light, emptied of fight. Lips cracked and crusted with blood. One hind leg had swollen twice the size of the other, and at the joint, yellow pus oozed like a silent scream of rot. Beneath its frail body, the straw was stained dark with dried blood, an unspoken warning to anyone who had ever watched death draw near. 3 figures stood nearby. The vet tech stared from beneath her cap, her expression vacant, cold, as if inspecting a broken tool. The barn manager, weathered, hard-edged, exhaled and turned away, too accustomed to dragging carcasses out before dawn. And then, there was Dr. Jonathan Miller, the veterinarian, an experienced man who had long ceased believing in miracles. "It's fading," Jonathan muttered, dropping the test results like an old coat. "Organ failure. Infection systemic. There's no therapeutic value left." His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. But it cut like a sentence passed in stone. He bent toward his leather case and pulled out a glass syringe, final punctuation for a life that had never been allowed a first chapter. That's when the engine roared, shattering the silence like a blade through canvas. A red-dusted pickup came barreling in like a desert storm. Its door flung open, and from the haze of heat and dust, a figure stepped down, sharp, urgent, and wrapped in an unexpected chill despite the desert blaze. Sophia Hart. She didn't walk. She stormed. Each footfall hit the earth like a declaration, thudding against the chest of everyone standing there. Her eyes, steel forged in fire, swept the scene like a warning. She didn't speak. Didn't ask. Didn't wait for explanation. She knelt beside the dying foal. "Stop." The word rang out, not loud, but enough to freeze every motion, break every momentum. "I haven't given my consent." She was the lead specialist for wild horse rehabilitation at the reserve, and she had seen more pain than anyone else here. Dust clung to her boots. Her jeans were caked in it. Her presence? Blazing. "Wait," she said again, turning her gaze onto Jonathan like a lance. "I'm not agreeing to this." "Sophia, it's dying," he replied evenly. "Dragging this out serves neither science nor mercy." She didn't look at him. Her hand went to the foal's neck, gently, reverently, like a silent prayer passed through touch. "I don't give up on anyone," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness like truth through fog. "Especially not a soul who's never been given a chance." The entire barn fell silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that stands between two outcomes, a stopped heart, or a new chapter. And in that moment, Sophia, no one else, was the only one standing on that fragile, flickering line between life and whatever comes after. The late afternoon wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the familiar scent of dry hay and scorched earth. But Sophia Hart heard none of it. The only sound echoing inside her was the beat of her own heart, pulling her backward, to a place she'd spent years trying to bury. Chicago. Boardrooms thick with tension. Phone calls that never stopped. And the sound of screeching brakes as a truck tore through a red light and ripped her world in half. When she woke up in the hospital, her body no longer belonged to her. The lower half was paralyzed. The doctor's face was expressionless when he said, "The chance of walking again is very low." Sophia didn't cry. She stayed silent. Tears weren't enough to wash away the feeling of being discarded by fate itself. Before the accident, Sophia was a rising star in corporate law. Her name lit up the covers of finance magazines. Multi-million-dollar deals. Cross-examinations sharp as scalpels. Praise from investors and partners alike. Her life had seemed destined for the summit. But in that rehabilitation room, wrapped in a hospital gown, learning to walk again with crutches like a child, Sophia saw it clearly. All the applause in the world couldn't restore faith. And it sure as hell couldn't save a soul. Then Claire appeared. An older woman with weathered hands shaped by years of working with horses. She didn't arrive with credentials or medical records. She just showed up, pushed Sophia's wheelchair out of the sterile rehab facility, and said, "There's something else you need to try." Where Claire took her wasn't a hospital. It wasn't even a therapy center. It was a modest farm on the outskirts of Illinois, where broken, discarded wild horses were brought in and slowly reminded how to trust. And there, Sophia met Silverlight. An old stallion. Coat the color of ash. Eyes dulled by a life too long and too hard. He didn't approach humans. Didn't neigh. Didn't react. As if his heart, too, had been abandoned by the world. On the first day, Sophia just sat beside his corral in silence. On the second, she reached out, he turned away. On the third, she slumped against the wooden rail, exhaled, and whispered, "We're not so different, you and I. They've already written us off." No one taught Sophia how to connect with a horse. There were no step-by-step guides. Only time, patience, and a shared kind of pain between two creatures who'd both been thrown away. Then one day, Silverlight stepped forward and gently touched his forehead to her shoulder. It was a touch so light, yet Sophia trembled like lightning had struck through her bones. She broke down, sobbing. Not from pain, but because for the first time in months, she knew she could still feel. From that day forward, she never returned to court. She didn't need it anymore. She followed Claire, studied equine rehabilitation, earned a degree in animal behavior science. But more than all that, she rediscovered something far more vital, something not found in spotlights or titles. She found her truest self in the silent gaze of wild beings who could not lie. When she announced her decision to move to Wyoming, People said she was insane. To abandon a brilliant legal career, a penthouse condo in downtown Chicago, to live among wind, dust, and animals that brought in no profit? But Sophia never hesitated. She sold every share in her firm, cut ties with the social circles that once praised her, and poured every last cent into reviving a long-abandoned horse rehab facility on the outskirts of Laramie. She built it back, board by board, gate by gate, stall by stall, with her own hands and the help of a few local ranchers. She learned how to treat wounds, how to spot infection, and how to read the unspoken language of trauma in a creature's eyes. From the woman who once brokered seven-figure deals, she became the one kneeling in the snow, picking blood-soaked straw out from under a dying Mustang. And still, Sophia smiled. "For the first time in my life," she said once, "I'm not running anymore." And now, here in this desolate plain, this dry, blazing cradle of dust and silence, another soul lay on the verge of being silenced by a needle. A soul who had never even been given a name. And as Sophia placed her hand gently on the foal's trembling neck, every memory returned: Silverlight, the pain, the redemption she thought she'd buried. "Wind," she whispered, though the foal had no name, "if you're still here, then so am I." The wind wasn't as fierce as the day before, but the scent of scorched earth still lingered in the air. Morning sunlight filtered through the slats of the corral, casting long shadows over the cracked ground. In the center of the pen, the foal lay motionless. No neigh, no twitch. But Sophia's heart remained beside him, unmoving, unwavering, all through the night. Wind. That's what she had named him. Not because he had responded, but because she believed, if a living soul still has a name, it still has a chance. Wind's pulse, faint but present, fluttered beneath her fingers. His breath whispered like the last ember in a dying fire. His eyes, half-lidded and glazed, seemed to see nothing but silhouettes of a world already slipping away. Jonathan Miller entered, bringing with him the sharp scent of antiseptic and the quiet weight of resignation. His eyes settled on Sophia, disheveled hair, bloodshot eyes, but still burning with resolve. He sighed. "You stayed all night?" "Not my first time," she replied, and never leaving Wind's neck. He stepped closer, opened his kit, and began checking vitals. Body temperature, heart rate, gum color. Each movement was clean, precise. But as he reached the final check, something in his face changed. "There's improvement," he murmured. "Not much, but it's there." Sophia met his eyes, unflinching. "You still want to inject him?" Jonathan crouched down beside her. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his glasses and wiped them against his shirt. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "According to the data, according to experience, this shouldn't be happening. But there's something in the way he keeps breathing, keeps holding on, that's making me reconsider." Sophia said nothing. She just continued to stroke Wind's trembling neck. Beneath the delicate skin, a battle raged that only the foal could understand. "What do you think?" Jonathan asked, his voice softened now, no longer clinical. "I think," she said quietly, eyes still fixed on Wind, "he's already made his choice. The real question is, do we have the courage to believe in it?" A long silence stretched between them. Not tense. Just the kind of silence that comes when standing at the edge of a decision no textbook could ever guide. Finally, Jonathan stood up and returned the syringe to his case. 24 more hours, he said. I'll come back tomorrow morning. Sophia nodded. But just as he turned to leave, her voice called out behind him. Thank you for not closing the door. He didn't look back, just raised a hand in a quiet wave. Perhaps a farewell. Perhaps an unspoken admission. Alone again with wind, Sophia leaned against the fence and gazed into the distance. The sun had fully risen now, casting light across the entire sanctuary. But in her mind, everything revolved around one single point. The fragile life lying beside her. As long as you still want to live, she whispered, I won't let go. There was no reply. Only the softest exhale. Like a single, fragile thread of breath. Still holding on. Evening light dimmed slowly over the red earth of Wyoming. The sounds of insects began to hum beyond the fences, but Sophia's heart hadn't moved from Wynn's side. Since morning, she had tried every conventional method, electrolyte solution, muscle massages to prevent atrophy, heavy blankets for warmth. But the fragile body beside her showed little change. Every breath was still a struggle. Sophia closed her eyes. In the wind, she heard something distant. A piece of memory. Martha. Her grandmother, Irish to the bone, who used to place a hand on Sophia's fevered forehead and whisper things no textbook could explain. As a child, Sophia had asked, "What are you doing?" Martha had only smiled, unlistening, to find where the pain is hiding. Sophia had once thought it was superstition. But here now, next to a life hanging by a thread, she understood. Some things cannot be measured. Yet they exist. She took a clean cloth, soaked it in warm water, and gently wiped Wynn's eyes and mouth. Then she placed one hand on his forehead, the other on his frail chest. She didn't pray. She just breathed. And from her palms, she imagined a soft white light slowly spreading, wrapping itself around the tiny frame below. She didn't know what to call it. Energy, maybe. Or life. Or simply faith. Then, naturally, almost instinctively, her lips began to hum a melody. It wasn't loud. It had no words. Just a lullaby that had slept in her memory for years, a tune Martha used to sing when night fell. A song without lyrics, just rhythm. The sound of a mother's hands. A heartbeat's whisper. A comfort beyond language. Her voice blended into the breeze. Soft as breath. But Sophia felt something in the air shift. The wind gentled. The space around them seemed to hold its breath. Wind stirred. His ear twitched. A front leg bent slightly. Sophia froze, heart tight in her chest. Then, his eyes opened. Just a sliver. And for the first time, they locked with hers. The moment was brief. But it was enough. Enough to tell her the door wasn't closed. There was still fire inside him. She kept singing, this time, clearer, steadier. Her hands stayed in place, as if forming a bridge between her heart and the soul fighting beside her. That night, Sophia never left the stall. Outside, the wind still whispered. But inside that small pen, another sound filled the space. A gentle song. A silent connection. A fragile hope. Sustained not by science, but by love. And the kind of knowing that lives outside explanation. The early morning breeze swept gently across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it a thin mist and the earthy scent of damp soil after a long night. Sunlight had yet to fully break through, but a pale shaft of light slipped through the straw-covered roof of the stable, landing on the corner where Wind lay, and where Sophia still sat, nearly sleepless. Her lullaby still echoed in her throat, now hoarse from hours of singing. She dared not stop. Not because she believed her voice held some divine power, but because in the silence there might be nothing left but the sound of fading breath, or nothing at all. And then it happened. Wind's leg twitched, barely noticeable, but Sophia froze, eyes wide, unmoving. One of his ears quivered, ever so slightly, like a subconscious response to a distant sound. She held her breath. Wind's eyes, cloudy and dim for days, fluttered open once more. This time, it wasn't just a reflex. It wasn't a flicker of life. It was a gaze. Faint, but real. And it was looking at her. Sophia? Jonathan's voice behind her struck like a chill up her spine. She turned, startled. He'd been standing there, quietly. No footsteps. No knock. Just the silence of a man who had seen many creatures die, but had never witnessed something quite like this. She pointed to Wind and whispered, "You see it too, don't you?" Jonathan stepped forward slowly, knelt beside them. He placed a hand on the foal's forehead, then checked the gums. Pulse. Breathing. Then he paused, staring into the same eyes Sophia had just seen open. Not hollow. Not drifting. But anchored. "Good Lord," he murmured. "What the hell did you do?" Sophia didn't answer. She didn't know. She just sat there, one hand still on Wind's neck, her heart pounding like a war drum. That feeling, raw, fragile, she didn't dare name it yet. "Hope!" Heart rate stabilizing, Jonathan said quickly. His voice had lost its calm neutrality, now rushed, caught between awe and disbelief. Body temperatures rising. Neurological reflexes responding. This isn't a death spiral anymore. This is a reversal. Sophia swallowed, voice barely audible. "He's been fighting all night." Jonathan looked at her. "Not just him. You too." Silence hung in the air. But it wasn't the silence of despair anymore. It was the fragile stillness of hope. The kind that could vanish with a single wrong word. Sophia bowed her head and rested her forehead gently against Wind's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting go." Outside, the sun finally peaked above the mountains. The first light of day pierced through the dust-laced air, illuminating two figures. One woman, one horse, leaning into each other as if they had never been apart. The message from the rescue station lit up Sophia's phone just as the sun crested over the mountain. "Sophia, we've received a new band of Mustangs from the Northern Ranger Station. We need urgent behavioral assessment. No one else can handle it but you." She looked down at Wind. His breathing was still fragile, but his eyes were open. There was still light, still presence. Jonathan was checking vitals when he looked up. "Sophia, that situation's serious too. No one would blame you if you left for a few hours." She gave a faint smile, but in her eyes, something cold as forged steel. "I left once before in my life, and I lost everything." Jonathan didn't reply. He simply nodded. He understood that what she'd said wasn't an excuse. It was a vow. Sophia replied to the station. I'm not coming. Send someone else. I'm staying. The wind began to shift colder. Another white night was coming. But tonight was not like the one before. Tonight carried the weight of hope, and the price of losing it. She lay down on the straw, right beside Wind. Her hand still touched his thin body, as if afraid he would vanish if she let go. In the darkness, she began to speak. Not prayers. Not pretty philosophies. Just truth. I used to think that clinging to something only caused more pain. That letting go was strength. But you're teaching me the opposite. That some things, as long as we hold on, they don't disappear. The wind hissed outside the stable walls. The barn was silent. I don't know if you can hear me. But if you're still fighting, then so am I. We go all the way, you hear me? She closed her eyes. Didn't sleep. Just listened. Wind's faint breath brushed against her arm with every fragile rise and fall. An hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. Just before dawn, before the sky changed color, Wind stretched his neck, gently, like a breeze slipping through. Sophia startled, sitting upright. The foal curled his front leg, trembling. His body was still frail, like a leaf in a storm. But he was trying. Clearly. Deliberately. Trying to stand. Sophia said nothing. Didn't move. She only watched. And had anyone else been there, they would have seen it. A silent tear tracing down her cheek. Because sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder. They begin when we simply refuse to walk away. The air was still, yet charged, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sophia hadn't moved. Her hand still rested gently against Wind's neck, her body curved beside his in quiet vigil. The sky outside was beginning to turn a shade lighter, a pale blue filtering in where night once ruled. She had watched him breathe for hours, counted every rise and fall. And now, something shifted. Wind's nostrils flared. Slight. Sharp. Deliberate. His ears twitched. Both, this time. Sophia sat up, not daring to hope. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it. Then, he moved. Not just a twitch. Not a spasm. But the deliberate curling of his front leg beneath him. The way a foal does when it's trying to rise for the first time. No, she whispered, almost afraid to speak it into reality. But Wind wasn't asking for permission. He was trying. His muscles trembled. He shifted again, back leg pulling in awkwardly. The entire motion was shaky, clumsy, like the earth itself tilted beneath him. But still, he tried. Outside, someone gasped. Jonathan Miller had just stepped into the barn. He froze mid-step, eyes wide as if witnessing something beyond his understanding. Wind, the foal everyone had given up on, was now balancing on 3 legs, struggling to pull the 4th into place. His ribs still showed. His eyes were glassy with effort. But the intent, God, the will, was undeniable. Jonathan didn't speak. He couldn't. Sophia stood, slowly, like any sudden movement might scare the moment away. Her hands hovered near Wind's flanks, but she didn't touch him. This wasn't her fight. This was his. With a deep groan, Wind braced, then pushed. His legs buckled, then straightened. And just like that, the foal stood. A trembling, wobbling silhouette in the golden hue of dawn. No one moved. Even the horses in nearby stalls fell silent, as if nature itself paused to witness what should not have been possible. Wind took a breath, his first standing breath, and let it out in a ragged huff. Sophia's hand covered her mouth. Jonathan blinked hard, clearing something from his eyes he wouldn't admit to. Sophia stepped forward finally, voice thick with tears. "You did it. You beautiful, impossible thing. You did it." Wind didn't collapse. He didn't falter. He just stood there, alive, defiant. And in that quiet barn, hope didn't knock on the door. It walked in on 4 trembling legs. It started with small things. Wind stood longer each time. He walked, wobbly at first, then steadier, until the dirt beneath his hooves began to remember what it felt like to be claimed by motion. Sophia watched every step like it was a miracle reborn. In truth, it was. But it wasn't just the physical recovery. Something else was happening. When she touched him, even lightly, Wind would pause. His breath would synchronize with hers. When she entered the barn, he would lift his head before she said a word. When she was anxious, he shifted uneasily. When she smiled, he sighed like something inside him relaxed. It wasn't training. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. Word began to spread. First among the sanctuary staff, then further. Videos. Photos. The foal who shouldn't have survived. The woman who refused to let go. Together, they became something of a phenomenon. Jonathan, ever the scientist, began documenting everything. "He reacts to you in ways I can't explain," he told her one morning. "It's like he reads you. Or maybe you read each other." Sophia didn't argue. She didn't have to. She felt it too. Wind had become more than a survivor. He had become a mirror. Experts came. Researchers. Behaviorists. A professor from a university in Nevada asked to observe their sessions. They measured cortisol levels, tracked eye movement, heart rates. No one could quite quantify what they were witnessing, but no one could deny it either. "It's like you two are linked," one specialist said. "But not through training or conditioning. It's something deeper. Something older." Sophia didn't know how to explain it. All she knew was this. When Wind had been on the brink, she'd felt something inside her break open. A wound she thought had healed, but never truly had. And through that crack, something else had bloomed, soft, strange, wordless. The same thing she now saw in Wind's eyes every time he looked at her. They weren't just healing. They were healing through each other. And it was only the beginning. The attention surrounding Sophia and Wind had reached far beyond the sanctuary by now. But for Sophia, the miracle unfolding before her was intimately familiar, because she had lived it once before. Years ago, she had arrived at a rundown rehabilitation farm in Illinois, paralyzed from the waist down and hollowed out by grief. Doctors had written her off. Specialists spoke in percentages. Sophia had stopped listening. That's where she met Silverlight. An old gray Mustang. Eyes dulled by time. Silent. Untouched. He kept to the back of the stall, unmoving. Sophia was only supposed to observe. She was still in a wheelchair, barely able to brush a mane. But something about Silverlight's stillness spoke to something inside her. She began sitting outside his stall, silent, waiting. A few days in, he flicked an ear. A week later, he stepped closer. One day, while she adjusted her foot brace, he walked to the gate, lowered his head, just slightly. Sophia reached up, a hesitant touch, and something cracked open. She cried that night, not from pain, but because something in her could still feel. Day after day, Silverlight stayed close. No training, no words, just presence. As Sophia learned to stand, then walk, then ride, he was always nearby. People said she saved him. She always said the opposite. He had brought her back first. Now, watching wind take his place in the world, Sophia felt that same current, that same invisible thread. But this time, she wasn't the one being lifted. She was lifting in return. Sophia had always believed that horses could reach places in the human soul where words could not. But nothing could have prepared her for what Braveheart would teach them all. He was a tall, copper-coated Mustang with a torn left ear and a calm, weighty gaze, like he'd seen too much and judged none of it. The sanctuary had taken him, and after a lightning storm scattered his herd and left him limping near a roadside fence. It took weeks for him to let anyone near. But when he finally did, he walked straight past the trainers, toward a man who hadn't spoken in almost a year. His name was Staff Sergeant Cole Maddox. Honorably discharged. Diagnosed with severe combat PTSD. He had arrived at the sanctuary as part of an experimental human equine therapy pilot, recommended by his VA counselor after traditional treatments failed. Silent, closed off, and borderline volatile, Cole barely made it through the intake without breaking something. But Braveheart. The moment their eyes met, something clicked. No one spoke. No commands were given. Braveheart simply approached, slowly, then stopped inches from Cole's wheelchair. He lowered his head, not as a greeting, but as a surrender. A recognition. Cole stared. Then, after what felt like a small eternity, he raised a trembling hand and touched Braveheart's face. What happened in the days after became legend inside the sanctuary. Cole began showing up early, staying late. He brushed Braveheart's coat for hours, whispering things no one else could hear. And Braveheart, in turn, would rest his head on Cole's shoulder and close his eyes, as if grounding them both to the earth. There was no therapy manual for what they were doing. But it worked. The first time Cole spoke again, it wasn't to a person. It was to the horse. "You're still here. I guess I can be too." From there, healing bloomed in uneven, extraordinary steps. Cole had nightmares, but they didn't break him. Panic attacks, but Braveheart would nudge his chest, anchoring him. And one afternoon, Sophia watched from a distance as Cole climbed down from the fence and, on shaking legs, walked to the center of the paddock, where Braveheart waited like he'd always known he would. The VA called it anecdotal. The sanctuary called it sacred. And Sophia, she called it another thread in a tapestry far older than science. "Not all wounds bleed," she once told a visiting researcher. "But that doesn't mean they don't cry out." Braveheart had answered a cry that no one else could hear. And in doing so, he reminded them all, healing isn't always a cure. Sometimes, it's simply a hand, or a hoof, that says, "I'm not leaving." They had tried everything: occupational therapy, art therapy, music therapy. But nothing had reached Lucy. She was 9 years old. A car accident had taken her parents and left her trapped for hours in the wreckage. Since that day, she hadn't spoken a word. No outbursts. No crying. Just silence. Her aunt and legal guardian brought her to the sanctuary as a last resort. She doesn't need a therapist, the woman had said. She needs something real. Something that doesn't ask her questions. Wind didn't approach Lucy the way he did others. He didn't walk toward her right away. He watched. Lucy sat near the edge of the fence line every day, sketchbook in her lap, eyes darting quickly away whenever someone noticed her looking. One afternoon, Wind moved closer. Not because anyone guided him. Not because someone asked him to. But because he chose to. He stopped a few feet away and waited. Lucy didn't flinch. She just stared at him, eyes wide, cautious. He lowered his head slowly, ears tilted slightly forward. Still, he didn't move closer. The next day, she returned. And the next. And the next. Until one morning, she stood up, walked across the paddock, and placed her hand, shaking and small, on Wind's shoulder. He didn't move. He only blinked, and then lowered his head again. That was the beginning. Sophia observed from a distance, careful not to interfere. Something sacred was forming. Then came the moment. A week later, the paddock was quiet. Wind stood with his head near Lucy's shoulder. She was brushing him, small, gentle strokes, her body curved close like she was afraid to disturb the stillness. And then, with no warning, no build-up, she whispered, "Thank you, Wind." Sophia froze. Jonathan dropped his clipboard. Lucy's aunt gasped. The words weren't loud, but they carried like thunder. 3 words. That was all. But they opened a door that had been locked tight by fear and grief for nearly a year. Wind didn't react like a hero. He didn't rear or whinny. He just stayed still, present, listening. And for the first time in months, Lucy smiled. Healing sometimes arrives in quiet moments. And sometimes, it only takes 3 words to bring the world back into focus. Thank you, Wind. By now, Wind was no longer just a survivor. He was a case study, a mystery, and a symbol. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe, a respected neuroscientist and trauma researcher from Stanford, arrived at the sanctuary with a team of analysts and biometric specialists. She wasn't there to disprove anything. She came because she had seen the data, and it defied every model she'd worked with. Cortisol levels, oxytocin, heart rate synchrony. But more than numbers, it was the inexplicable consistencies. Every subject who interacts with Wind shows immediate physiological change, she said during the initial briefing. Lower blood pressure, reduced anxiety markers, and more than that, expressions of trust, of emotional surrender. Jonathan Miller, who had once been the most skeptical voice at the sanctuary, now stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding slowly. I've seen it. It's not a fluke. And it's not suggestion. There's something deeper at play here. Over weeks, they conducted dozens of controlled interactions. Veterans, children with trauma, first responders, even people diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression. Every single one, had some measurable reaction, and many had breakthroughs. Sophia participated not as a researcher, but as a conduit. Wind didn't perform tricks. He didn't behave like a therapy animal trained to obey. He simply was. And that was enough. Dr. Monroe's final report didn't speak in absolutes, but it concluded with one stunning statement. We are witnessing a form of relational healing that cannot yet be mapped by science. But it exists. It is real. And it is replicable in specific, emotionally safe human-animal environments. The sanctuary received calls from universities, trauma centers, even federal agencies. But Sophia wasn't interested in attention. Neither was Jonathan. Let them write about it, he said one night, looking out over the paddock. Let the world argue. We know what we've seen. Sophia nodded, watching Wind graze peacefully under the moonlight. He's not here to prove something, she said. He's here to remind us what we've forgotten, that love is medicine too. And for the first time, the world was ready to listen. By the time Wind turned 4, he had outgrown the label of survivor and assumed something greater, a guide, a symbol of something that defied logic yet demanded belief. He was taller now, his chestnut coat darker and more defined, his movements fluid, calm, but grounded in a presence no one could deny. When visitors arrived, skeptical, broken, uncertain, they didn't ask for a therapist. They asked to see Wind. And Sophia, standing beside him, finally understood the scope of what they had become. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about sharing the healing. She and Jonathan co-developed what would be called the Wind method, a structured, yet intuitive approach to human equine relational therapy based on trust, presence, and nonverbal connection. It wasn't marketed with slogans. It wasn't packaged as a miracle cure. But word spread fast. Veterans brought their trauma. Children brought their silence. Grieving mothers brought their loss. And Wind, without judgment, without effort, received it all. The Wind method emphasized being, not doing. There were no commands, no forced tasks. Just a space where a person could exist beside an animal who had survived and come through the other side, not untouched, but transformed. Workshops were offered. Not in cities, but in the paddocks. Not with lectures, but with shared silence. The sanctuary, once a place of quiet retreat, became something much larger. Not chaotic, never commercialized. But known, trusted, revered. One journalist wrote, "It's not what Wind does. It's what Wind allows others to become in his presence." And Sophia? She remained his anchor. Not his trainer. Not his handler. His witness. Standing beside him one golden evening, she watched a young woman weep openly while Wind stood motionless, his breath steady and slow. When asked later what Wind had done to trigger the moment, Sophia simply said, "He listened." That was all she needed. And so, the miracle lived on, not in the stories written about them, but in the ones quietly rewritten within those who had lost hope, and found it again in the eyes of a horse. The decision came quietly, not with fanfare, but with a sunrise. Wind stood at the crest of a hill, the light catching the ridges of his coat, a living statue carved from strength and serenity. Behind him, the sanctuary hummed with quiet motion. But Sophia saw something else, the future. They needed space. Not just for horses, but for healing. And so began the dream that would become reality, Winds Valley Healing Center. Set on 200 acres of reclaimed prairie outside Laramie, Wyoming, the center was designed not as an institution, but as a refuge. Wooden fences, open skies, minimal concrete. Everything breathed freedom. Horses rescued from abuse and abandonment would roam in carefully structured herds, relearning trust through each other before engaging with people. And the people who came, they came from everywhere. A firefighter haunted by a child he couldn't save. A woman who hadn't slept since her husband's suicide. A teenager whose arms bore the proof of battles no one saw. They came not for words, but for presence. And Wind? He was still there. Older now. Calmer. But unmistakable. When a new guest arrived, Wind would often be the first to notice, lifting his head, walking toward the fence, eyes already knowing. Sessions weren't structured by the clock. There were no set deliverables. Healing happened in stolen moments. A war veteran crying into a mane that didn't move. A child with autism giggling as a Mustang followed her shadow. A therapist standing speechless as a withdrawn man whispered his name aloud, for the first time in years. Jonathan managed the research. Sophia guided the process. But Wind remained the pulse. A valley wasn't just land. It was a place to fall safely. And now, with Wind's Valley open to the world, the prairie had a heart again. His name was Alex Hudson, 38. Former firefighter. Before the explosion, he had been the kind of man who made others feel safe just by walking into a room. But that day, when the old hotel collapsed around him in a wall of flame, he lost more than his squad. He lost his voice, his purpose, and something far deeper. The scars on his arms and neck were visible. The ones in his mind were harder to trace. At Winds Valley, he didn't speak for the first 3 days. He didn't look anyone in the eye. When Sophia introduced him to Wind, he didn't even lift his head. But Wind did. The Mustang approached without hesitation. No caution. No probing. Just presence. He stood before Alex, close enough to touch, but didn't nudge, didn't beg. He simply stood. Waiting. Alex didn't move. But he didn't walk away either. That night, Sophia found Alex still by the fence after everyone else had gone. He was sitting cross-legged in the dust, watching Wind graze under the moonlight. "He doesn't expect anything from me," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since arriving. "No," Sophia replied. "He never does." The next morning, Alex asked to help muck stalls. The next week, he joined a silent walk with the herd. By month's end, Wind would follow him freely, no lead, no rope, just trust. The fire hadn't taken Alex's life, but it had taken his story. Wind helped him start writing it again. And on the last day of his program, standing beside the horse who had never once asked him to be anything but present, Alex placed his palm against Wind's chest and said, "You brought me back to something I thought was gone." Sophia didn't interrupt. She simply watched. Because sometimes, redemption isn't loud. Sometimes, it smells like hay, sounds like breath, and stands on 4 hooves in a field of silence. There were stories at Winds Valley that never made it to the news. Quiet ones. Gentle ones. But they carried their own weight. Like the man who'd lost his son in a drowning accident. He hadn't spoken to anyone about it in 2 years. Until one afternoon, a small black mare named Luna approached him in the pasture. She stood by his side for hours, her breath matching his. And when she nuzzled his chest, he broke down, not in grief, but in release. Later, he told Sophia, she didn't remind me of what I lost. She reminded me I could still feel. Or the teenager who hadn't touched another living thing since surviving a school shooting. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact. But when a golden Mustang named Ember walked beside her on the trail, she reached out, not to control, not to lead, but simply to touch. She whispered, "I'm still here." These moments didn't fit into scientific charts. They couldn't be replicated in labs. But they happened. And Wind? He didn't take the lead in every case. Sometimes, he simply watched from the hill. Let others step forward. Let new bonds form. Sophia began keeping a journal, not of procedures, but of patterns. A look. A shared breath. A silence that shifted. She wrote down things like, "Today, a woman with Parkinson's walked 10 steps farther because a gelding named Flint kept pace beside her without needing to be asked. A child with selective mutism read a poem out loud because Whisper the Foal lay beside her for an hour." No one could explain it. But no one tried to deny it anymore. Wind's Valley had become a sanctuary not just for broken bodies, but for fractured spirits. Some stories ended with transformation, some with quiet acceptance. But all of them began the same way, with a horse who didn't need to understand, only to stay. It took nearly a year. A full year of data, interviews, neurofeedback readings, cortisol analysis, heart rate monitors, trauma inventories, and session transcriptions. But when Dr. Elizabeth Monroe finally stepped onto the podium at the International Conference on Equine-Assisted Therapies, she wasn't holding a hypothesis. She was holding evidence. The Wind method was no longer anecdotal. It was peer-reviewed, validated, and endorsed. "Connection," she began, her voice steady despite the cameras. "We've always known it mattered. But we didn't realize how deeply it could heal until we studied Wind." Behind her, slides showed graphs, body scans, testimonial clips, case videos. But nothing spoke louder than the footage of Wind walking quietly beside a veteran, a child, a woman with Parkinson's, all without being led. Just presence. Just being. "The science doesn't explain it all," she admitted, "but it proves enough to say this: relational, nonverbal, emotionally attuned animal-human bonding is a replicable therapeutic breakthrough. Especially when initiated by animals who have themselves experienced trauma and emerged with trust." The auditorium gave a standing ovation. News outlets picked it up. Foundations offered grants. But Sophia stayed grounded. Wind still stood on that hill every morning, watching the sunrise. He hadn't changed. He didn't need to. She and Jonathan were invited to speak at universities. Veterans Affairs began integrating Wind method protocols into early pilot programs. A trauma clinic in Canada sent an entire team to observe. But when asked how it all began, Sophia always said the same thing. With a horse who shouldn't have lived, and a woman who refused to walk away. Wind never sought to heal the world. But the world, broken and breathless, came anyway. And now, science had finally caught up with the miracle. The question came often. From journalists. From therapists. From strangers. "Can you explain why it works?" And Sophia always gave the same answer, quiet, but certain. "Because it's love. Not the kind that demands, not the kind that expects, but the kind that simply is. Wind had never learned commands. He didn't perform. He didn't obey. He chose. He chose to walk toward the wounded. He chose to stay. And every time Sophia watched him lower his head beside a trembling child, or stand still while someone sobbed into his mane, she realized something she had no words for in those early days. This wasn't about healing in the clinical sense. It was about being seen. Over time, she stopped trying to explain it. Stopped offering theories or scientific footnotes. Instead, she let the visitors find their own truths. Some left in tears. Some left laughing. All left changed. And at the end of each day, when the last volunteer went home and the prairie turned soft under the golden light, Sophia would stand beside Wind, stroke his neck, and whisper, "You didn't just survive. You became the answer to a question no one knew how to ask." That, to her, was the miracle. Not that Wind had lived, but that in a world full of brokenness and doubt, he taught them all how to trust again, without a single word. The 5th anniversary of Wind's rescue dawned under skies the color of memory, soft, endless, and wide. The sanctuary had changed since that first trembling breath. New buildings, new faces, but the heart of it all remained unchanged. Wind. Now fully grown, he carried a quiet nobility in every step. His coat shimmered with health, his eyes mirrored peace. He was no longer the foal who fought death, but the symbol of what it meant to live. And today, the world came to celebrate him. They called it the Festival of the Wind. There were no banners, no marching bands, just people, hundreds of them, gathered in silence beneath the prairie sun. Survivors, therapists, families, soldiers, children. Each person had a story. Each one had been changed. Sophia stood at the hill's crest beside Jonathan and Dr. Monroe. Her voice trembled when she began to speak. 5 years ago, we were preparing to say goodbye. Instead, Wind gave us a beginning. Applause followed. Not thunderous, but deep, human. Then, one by one, they came forward. A man in uniform placed a medal at Wind's feet. A young girl laid a drawing. A mother whispered thanks. Wind didn't react with flair. He simply stood, listened. Let each offering pass through him like wind through grass. Later, as dusk softened the sky, the herd was released. Wind led them, not in dominance, but in trust. And behind him, a ripple of laughter, weeping, and all moved through the crowd. That night, as candles flickered across the valley, Sophia whispered one sentence into the dark. Wind was never just a horse. He was the breath of a world learning to believe again. The celebration had ended. The candles had burned down to wax puddles beneath the stars. The crowd was gone, the banners tucked away. But Wind remained. And so did Sophia. She stood beside him in the stillness of the prairie night, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder. No cameras. No speeches. Just them. Wind turned his head slowly, looked at her, and for a moment, it was as if the entire 5-year journey collapsed into a single glance. The nights of no sleep, the broken bodies, the silent children, the healing breath, the rising sun. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They had saved each other. The foal who had no name. The woman who had nothing left to give. And yet here they stood. Whole. Connected. Alive. Sophia closed her eyes and whispered into the wind. Maybe miracles were never meant to be explained. Maybe they were only meant to be believed. And maybe, just maybe, love itself is the miracle. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share what it meant to you. Hit the like button and share this video with someone who might need a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory so you won't miss the next powerful stories about love, life, and the miracles born between humans and the wild souls they dare to believe in. Because somewhere out there, the wind never stops blowing.